Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Psychology of Games podcast. My name is Dr. Jamie Madigan, and I am your host for this episode and all others. Just a quick reminder, this is the time when I tell you that you can go to psychologyofgames.com to find out all about me, other episodes of this podcast, 50 or so. You can find out how to subscribe to the podcast, and you can find hundreds of other articles that I've written about the overlap between psychology and video games. You can find out how to follow me on social media. I'm at Jamie Madigan on Twitter, for example. And you can get information on my book about psychology and video games as well. So speaking of books, I have been cultivating kind of a little habit every day, most days, where I set aside about 30 minutes to read. And it's usually first thing in the morning, like around 7:30 in the morning before I start my work for the day. And a lot of times it's things that I bookmarked and put into Pocket, or journal articles that I printed off to maybe think about writing articles about them for the website for Psychology of Games. But this summer I've also fit in at least a couple of books about psychology and video games and products and so forth that I thought might be of interest to the people that listen to this podcast and read the website. So I'm going to do another quick mini series of podcasts, this episode and the next, where I talk to the people who wrote a couple of the books that I've read this summer. This is going to be the first episode. It's very much about psychology and video games and research on those things. And we'll go into a little bit of conversation, interview with the author, and then in the next episode, we'll do another book. And if you have any suggestions for books or other things related to this along these lines you think I should add to my collection, let me know. You can leave a comment on the blog post that goes with this episode of the podcast, or you can find me on psychologyofgames.com. Thanks and enjoy. All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome to the interview for this podcast. My guest expert this episode is Dr. Pete Etchells. He is a psychologist, a video game researcher, and a science writer, all in one. Currently, he works as a reader in psychology and science communication at Bath Spa University in the UK, which does have the most relaxing name of any university that I have ever heard of. His research there examines the behavioral effects of video games. Dr. Etchells is a prolific science writer, and he's written for the Cosmic Shambles Network, The Guardian, The Observer, Telegraph, Wired, and several other outlets. But more significantly right now, most recently, he's had a new book come out. It's called Lost in a Good Game, and it looks at the psychology and other science behind why we love games, what effects they have on us, and how we should think about the current public discourse and discussion around video games. So, Pete, Dr. Etchells, welcome to the podcast.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So I read the book, finished, I think I mentioned we were talking earlier, finished a couple of weeks ago. But before we dive into that, what kind of is your background in psychology and science writing?
So I've got a PhD in psychology, which I got in 2011, I think it was. My background in psychological research is very different to the stuff that I do now on video games. So I originally started out my academic life looking at how the human visual system works.
So eventually you went from interest in that area, though, to video games more generally, or media more generally?
Yeah, so both things kind of happened around about the same time. I started getting interested in public engagement and science communication in around about 2011, 2012.
Thank God somebody needs to, right?
Do you know, it's really embarrassing, and I think a lot of people who get into public engagement do this sometimes, in that you don't really look at what's happened already in that area, and you go, oh, I'm going to start a blog on science and talking to people about psychology and telling them all the cool stuff in there. Nobody's ever had this idea before. It's a genius idea. You start writing, and then you realize that there's this entire ecosystem of people who are doing it, and they're doing it better than you already. So I was one of those annoying people. Around about the same time, though, I started getting a little bit frustrated, I guess, with an increasing number of news headlines that were coming out that tried to make these negative links between video games and some sort of behavioral or health effect. And there was
So,
one.
so what year was this? What period was
This
this?
was around about 2011, 2012.
Okay.
Just after I finished my PhD. There was one headline in particular that always sticks in my mind, which was a UK newspaper, which shall remain nameless, went with the headline, "Computer games leave children with dementia, warns top neurologist."
Good Lord.
And when I read it, I wasn't angry so much as just a little bit confused, because you look at the research literature and there was nothing done on this sort of stuff, right? So there's no research that shows that kids are getting early onset dementia from playing video games.
I think you're more likely to find research about using games to treat dementia or Alzheimer's or something, right?
Yeah, there's some really interesting stuff happening now in terms of using video games to collect massive data sets on trying to understand how dementia actually starts.
So they got it wrong. They had somehow.
Yeah, I think it came from... So the person who was the top neurologist isn't actually a neurologist, they're a neuroscientist. And they hadn't done any research in that area. I think it came from a general issue that we see with how video games are reported on in the news, in that people who don't play them and don't really have much experience of them, I think often tend to view them with a bit of a skeptical or dubious eye. So they see them as something unwholesome. And I kind of get where people come from sometimes with that. Like, if you've never played video games before and you watch somebody playing something like Minecraft or Fortnite, it looks like a really jarring experience, right? So people are completely hooked on the screen, or it looks as though they're hooked on the screen. They're not paying attention to things that are happening around them. And it doesn't look like it's a natural or wholesome thing to do. But actually, as you well know, if you actually play games and you know what people are doing inside those virtual worlds, it's not nearly as scary as the headlines make out.
So that sort of propelled you into writing or investigating?
Yeah, a bit of both, actually. So in terms of doing research in that area, it was that headline, actually. I remember reading it, and in our university department, we'd always used to go down to the pub on a Friday night and have a drink and chat about research and life and the universe and everything. And I remember after a couple of pints, I was getting a little bit angry, I guess, about this headline. And there was a professor in the department at the time who said, "Well, look, why don't you put your money where your mouth is? We can do some research on this. You don't need to get a grant to do a study. So why don't we look at what data's out there already and do some work on it?" So that's how my first big project on video games came about, and that eventually coalesced. It wasn't anything to do with dementia in the end. It coalesced into a project where we took a huge data set called the Children of the 90s Study, which is this amazing data set in the UK, where I think about 15,000 mums-to-be in the early 90s were approached and basically asked, can we follow you and your child from now until the point at which they're grown up, and
no big deal. Yeah,
it's massive. Like the amount of stuff that they've got from that project. They've got endless labs full of hair samples and teeth samples and things like that, if you want to do those. But happily for us as well, they took some information on video game use around about 7, 8, 9 years of age, and around about 15, 16 as well. So we used this longitudinal set to look at whether there were any links between playing different types of games at an early age, in terms of whether they're violent or not, and whether there were any sorts of aggressive outcomes in the teenage years around 15, 16. And we basically found that there are some correlations. Basically, there are some weak associations. So if you do play some of the more violent games at that young age, about 7 or 8, you are maybe slightly more aggressive when you're 15 and 16, but really there's nothing massive to worry about there, which is kind of the line that a lot of the good research nowadays is taking as well.
Cool. So how did all of this stuff lead you to thinking, I need to write a book, and end up writing Lost in a Good Game?
I started writing a blog in 2011, and that was just on, I think it was blogs.com or something like that.
I remember that.
Yeah. I don't think it exists anymore. And not long afterwards, I got talking to people at Nature and got the opportunity to join the Nature Network, which was a blog network that was around at the time. It's not there anymore, unfortunately. And from there, eventually got to write for the Guardian Science Blog Network in around about 2013-14. And I found myself just writing more and more about video games research, really, and all the problems in those areas and what we do and do not know about their effects, largely in a kind of reactive way, in the sense that there'd be a news article about how Call of Duty is the worst thing ever and it literally melts your brains. And I'd write stuff to say, well, look, that's not the case. This is what we actually know from the research. So I was writing for The Guardian for a while, and what I actually wanted to write a book about at the time was about psychology and about a lot of the problems that we see in psychological research and problems with things like being able to replicate well-known effects and findings and things like that, and what that means for our general understanding of psychology. And I pitched this idea for a book to my agent, and we bandied it about for about a year or so until he got to the point where he said, this is great, Pete, but I can't really see how to pitch it to publishers, so let's maybe give up on it. At that time, I'd been thinking about it so long that I kind of got bored of that idea anyway. And I said to him, well, look, why don't I write something about video games instead? Because something that he'd said that really stuck in my mind at the start of that whole process was that when you write a book, you've got to really sell yourself to the readers as to why you're the right person to talk about that thing that you're talking about. Mm-hmm. And in the context of video games, I thought, well, I do research on this. It forms a part of my job. I've been playing video games for most of my life. And actually, when I was thinking about it more and more, I thought there are these really important, big things that have happened in my life, not always good things. And video games, in some way, shape, or form, have featured in them. So it made sense to talk about those personal things, just to try and kind of relate to people who maybe don't play video games so much, what sorts of impacts and effects that they can have on people, and couple that with what I know and what we don't know about the psychological effects of video games. So that's kind of where the book came from, really. It just felt right in the end, I think, when I kind of finished the first manuscript. Never happy with the first manuscript. It's not necessarily massively happy with the final manuscript. I think there's always
if you're happy with the first draft, you've set your standards far too low.
Yeah, you've not written enough. But I looked back on it and I thought, I can see how this makes sense now. I can see why maybe I was the right person to write about this sort of stuff.
Yeah. So who's the audience for this book? Who do you think should pick up a copy? I mean everyone, right? So every person on the planet, sure. But
everybody should buy my book.
Who did you tell your publisher or the audience was for this book?
It was quite a hard thing to do, actually, because what I was trying to do with it was cross a couple of boundaries. So I wanted it to be enticing for people who do play video games, because I think it's useful to think critically about a lot of the stuff we see about what the effects of video games are. And it's useful to have the kind of psychological research evidence base to back up discussions about that. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to pitch it towards people who play games, but I also wanted to pitch it towards people who don't necessarily have much experience of it, or, for example, parents who are worried about games. They don't necessarily play them themselves, but they've got a vested interest in it because their kids play games and they're worried about the potential effects of those. Mm-hmm. And that was quite a hard thing to do, because you don't want to go too nerdy on the video game lore and pop culture references, because you'll lose people who don't get those.
And they'll be outdated, right?
Unless you go full blown Ready Player One and just go full nostalgia trip into the 80s. But equally, I didn't want it to be too simplistic's the wrong word, I guess, but too basic in a sense, so that would put off people who know quite a lot of stuff about video games already. Mm-hmm. It's a really difficult line to tread. I don't think it worked massively well in some cases, and it worked really well in others. But one thing that was really useful, actually, was that my editor doesn't play video games. So it was nice to have him read this stuff.
What the hell are you talking about here?
Yeah, exactly. So, and some basic things that might need explaining to people who've never come across them. So, you start talking about boss battles in a game.
Critical hit or
you don't need to think about those, because everybody who plays video games intrinsically knows what they are. But for somebody who comes across those jargony terms for the first time, it could be quite off-putting if they're not if they're not well explained.
Yeah. So, I mean, my reading of the book seems like it's sort of your attempt to correct the public narrative and debates that's happening around games. Like, why do people like them? Are they a waste of time? Are they dangerous in terms of leading to addiction or violent behavior? And that kind of stuff. Is that a fair characterization? Or?
Yeah, definitely. I think I'm not trying to be an apologist for video games, because I think there are some things that we should worry about in terms of how they're developed and how they're marketed and monetized. But also, I guess the big thing is that I don't want the conversations around video games to be completely black and white, all good, all bad sorts of conversations, which is kind of the stuff that we see in the news all the time. It's either video games are addictive, or they're causing kids to lose their childhood, or there's the kind of backlash to those sorts of stories where people say, well, no, actually, here's all the great stuff, the benefits that video games have, and it's completely
much more idyllic.
Yeah. So it's more about kind of thinking about what your own preconceptions and beliefs are about video games, be it that you really like them and think that they're great, or you think that they're a really bad thing for society, and just trying to check them at the door a little bit and think a little bit more critically about why do we hold those beliefs, and what actually, if we kind of separate out the objective effects of video games from how we feel about them, what are those effects, and are there any things that we should be worried about? And critically, are there any things that lots of people are worried about, but we don't need to be concerned about so much?
So the subtitle for the book is why we play video games and what they can do for us. So, I mean, do you feel like you answered that first question? And like, why do we play video games, or why do gamers like to play games? If that's not too circular a question.
No. I think, well, I mean, the simple, obvious answer is that we play them because they're really fun things to do, right? They're a form of entertainment.
That's not satisfying. I mean, there's got to be more to it, right?
Scientifically, it's a really unsatisfying answer, and I think this is the bit that I struggled with that question, in that there is lots of research out there on the why question, but there are a few kind of issues with it, I guess. Part of it is historical in a way. So there's a really great paper that came out in 1996 by a guy called Richard Bartle, who was the developer of some of the original online role-playing games called MUDs. Yeah. And what he tried to do with that paper was look at what people do in those games. So how do they play it, basically? What can you come up with any archetypes? And he basically argued there were 4 archetypes. There are people who play MUDs to socialize with other people. There are people who play it for achievement, so they're interested in kind of getting the highest scores or getting really rare stuff. There are people who play it to explore, so they're interested not just in kind of exploring the game world, but exploring the physics engines behind games and trying to kind of tinker with how they work. And then there are people who are killers, basically griefers, who like going around and having fights with people and matches and contests and things like that.
And he actually like put those with different suits of a playing deck, right?
Cards. So hearts, diamonds, clubs, and spades. So I can never remember what the ordering was.
Who knows?
Hearts are socializers. Clubs are the killers, because that's what they used to kill people with. Spades are explorers, and diamonds are achievers.
Okay, that tracks.
Yeah, it makes sense. And it was a really great paper. It was by no means scientific, and he didn't intend it to be scientific. It was just almost like an ethnographic look at things like player transcripts in game and discussions in forums and things like that. But it ended up becoming a really influential paper. So lots of other researchers took this basic idea and they were like, well, can we apply this to other sorts of games? That's absolutely fine. That's generally how you do research, right? You build on previous ideas and try and adapt them in different sorts of ways. I think the problem that's happened over the years, though, is that maybe psychologists have become a little bit too rigid in thinking that these 4 archetypes are maybe the only ones that exist. Yeah. So the problem that you get is that if you develop a questionnaire that you want to give out to players of a random game to try and figure out why they play that game or how they play it, if you think of the dumbest way you can do that, you can have a question that's something like, to what extent do you play games to socialize with other people? And you might put 1 if you don't do it at all, and 10 if that's the only reason why you play. What you'll end up with that sort of question is a spectrum of people who are socializers, basically. So you're just reinventing the wheel all the time.
Yeah.
You might kind of elaborate on them and maybe break down those archetypes into kind of subcomponents, but essentially you're just reiterating those same 4 archetypes.
Yeah, it's like a confirmatory approach rather than exploring. Yeah.
So talk about this in the book in terms of being a problem, because if that carries on, then all you've got is this body of research that shows that there are 4 different types of people who play video games. And then if games developers get their hands on that research and go, okay, these are the types of people who play video games, this is what they want to do in games, my game must have a socializing element or an exploration element, things like that. So it almost starts to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I think we have to be really careful about not becoming too rigid in the way that we think about games, because there are increasingly evolving ways in which people play them and why they play them. So in 1996, nobody was playing, or not many people were playing video games to earn a living. That's a completely different state of affairs now. So trying to kind of include those new ways in which people interact with games, I think, is something that we need to do as psychologists, and try and break out of that rigid way of thinking. But that's all well and good. But really, that thinking around player archetypes isn't so much about why people play video games. It's more about how they play them, really. So those kind of 2 questions get a bit muddied sometimes. So there's a separate line of research in psychology that looks at intrinsic motivation, which is basically your motivation to do something because you enjoy it or get some sort of sense of fulfillment out of it.
As opposed to being rewarded, receiving some external reward or threat of punishment or something like that.
Basically, which would be extrinsic motivation. And there's a few lines of research in this area that, it's not groundbreaking, oh my God, wow, this changes my way of thinking about video games. It's fairly common sense stuff, right? So games that make people feel autonomous, so they're able to do things and have sort of freedom to do what they want in the game. Games that allow them to socialize and interact with other people, and games that allow them to show some sort of level of competence, so you can get better at the game and not get frustrated with things like the controls or the difficulty and things like that. Games that tick those 3 boxes tend to be the ones that do the best. So if they meet those motivational needs, then it tends to be a good game, and that's why we play them, because we get that sense of fulfillment out of them. So in a big kind of roundabout way, it does come back to that idea that we play games because we enjoy playing them.
Yeah.
But they've got to be an enjoyable experience in certain types of way in order for that to happen.
And that research has created some ideas around types, not specific things necessarily, but types of things that you can do, like, give players autonomy, make them important to other people, let them choose, those kinds of things.
Yeah, and obviously there's all sorts of other reasons why an individual might play video games as well. And I should say those things change over time. So you take an individual person, they might play games at one point for one reason. They might play it because all their mates are playing a game and that's why they want to socialize with them. And then another time they might be playing that same game for a different reason. They might play different games for different reasons at different times. And there are all sorts of other things going on that might impact on that why question. So one of the kind of running themes through the book is the idea of grief and loss. So I talk about my dad dying when I was 14. He had motor neuron disease. And I use video games at that point, not necessarily as a form of escapism, although that is probably what I was doing, but more of a way to just sort of give my brain a little bit of space just to process what had happened, really.
Yeah.
Because it was such a big, overwhelming thing that had happened. I just couldn't get my head around it. So I played a lot of games fairly religiously for a while and then got bored of them and stopped playing them, but played them for a while just to try and process what had happened. And things like that, things like playing games to explore our own emotions or to help cope with loss or to help cope with difficulties in our lives. They're things that aren't easily categorized in those sorts of systems that we've already talked about. And I think there's a lot more research that needs to be done in those sorts of realms to think about how games can be used in a good way and maybe sometimes in a bad way. So when does video gameplay become too much and it becomes a negative thing in terms of the grief process or whatever. So I'd like to see more research on that, but it's early days yet.
Yeah, it seems like motivation is only part of the puzzle, right? I mean, you can ask the question, or why are people intrinsically motivated to play games? And that's obviously an important question. It can help game designers amongst many other people. But then there are these other questions of, well, there's like, needs gratification from media psychology, so that may explain why people, play games. And then things like you were talking about, like coping with stress or escapism or dealing with other issues through an experience that you can control. So it seems like any one of those is only kind of part of the answer to why any individual might be playing games or going through a period where they're playing a lot of games or a lot of one game in particular.
Yeah, definitely. I think I'm careful to say this in the book that video games have helped me during some of those most difficult periods in my life. Yeah. But I'm not going to turn around and say, when you suffer a loss or something horrible in your life, you should go and play games because it will help you, because it's different for different people.
Yeah.
And there are people out there who have done that. They've tried to play video games in order to cope with something, and then that itself maybe has become a problem and maybe just made things worse. So there's no kind of prescriptive, and I don't think there should be a prescriptive way as to why we play games, because it's a very individual experience. In a similar sort of way, I talk in the book about what I like in video games, and something that draws me into them is they have to have a strong narrative. I really like games that have got a good story where I can get really immersed in a rich environment and feel as though I'm part of a story. I've talked to people about this online, and they kind of get quite defensive and say, well, that doesn't mean that that's a good game. And they say, well, yeah, I know, it might be different for you.
Yeah.
And that's absolutely fine. You play games because you want to play them for the reasons that you have. That's absolutely fine. You don't need to justify them to anybody.
Yeah. So I want to also talk about something you alluded to there with the debates and discussions and conversations around like violence in video games and game addiction and dark patterns around monetization and so forth.
Yeah.
But I kind of feel like we need to do what you did at one point in the book. You were like, yo, I want to talk about that stuff too, but first we need to talk about the state of research in video game psychology, like questionable research practices and this wonderful thing called pre-registration. And like being like a big research and psychology nerd myself, like I love that stuff. I saw that, I was like, yeah, right on. Totally. Let's go through, let's use some sunlight as disinfectant here and talk about these issues, but it may not be clear to other people. Although you do explain it, at the beginning of those chapters, but like what were those chapters about and why do you think they were important to include before you moved on to those other topics?
So part of the background to including, so I think it's the 5th chapter, really doesn't talk about video games at all. It talks about psychology generally. And from a historical point of view, the reason that I included that chapter was because I wanted to write that book about psychology generally.
That's right.
Before Lost in a Good Game. So that's kind of the leftover from that idea. But it is really relevant. So I should say probably the first thing to point out with video game research, psychological research in particular, is that it's really, really hard to do. It seems like it should be something easy. Like you get people to play a video game, you measure something afterwards, and you see whether that thing's changed or not as a result of playing a video game. But actually how you do that well so that you can be absolutely sure that the game itself or differences in the game or differences between two games that you get people to play are the thing that cause that change in behavior is remarkably hard to do. And it's a problem, I think, more widely that psychology has suffered from in the past few years, in that human behavior is really messy. People are really messy and they do annoying things that you don't want to do all the time. And to try and kind of pin down, if I change X in my experiment, then that definitely and solely causes a change in Y, therefore X and Y are linked. It's really hard to do that sort of stuff. And what's happened over the years is that psychologists generally maybe have got a little bit lax in the way that they do research, just because there's no specific way to do something. If I come up with a video game study, and I think about how I'm going to implement that in terms of the methodology, and then think about what sort of statistical analyses I'm going to do afterwards, there's lots and lots of decisions that I need to make about those things. And usually what happens in psychological research is that we kind of wing it a little bit. So you kind of make those decisions on the fly.
So those decisions are like, who are the subjects going to be? What questions am I going to ask? What data am I going to collect? How am I going to analyze the data? What are my thresholds for supporting my hypotheses or not with the results? Those kinds of things.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Even things like, how many people am I going to test? And how many conditions am I going to run them through in my experiment? Things like that. So the risk, if you don't make those decisions up front before you start collecting any data, if you try and make them on the fly, then the risk is that various sorts of unconscious biases start to slip in. So let's say that your kind of fundamental starting point and belief is that video games are really, really bad for us, right?
Okay.
And that's what you believe, right? For whatever reason. And you run a study looking at, so you get people to play a violent game or a non-violent game, and then you have some sort of measure of aggression afterwards. So you're looking at whether the people in the violent game condition are more aggressive after playing that game than the people in the non-violent condition. So you run that study and you collect this data on aggression, and you run it through a certain type of statistical analysis. And it comes out saying that there's no differences between the two groups. What you might do at that point is go,
that's terrible.
Is say, yeah, oh, maybe I've done the stats wrong.
Yeah.
I know it. Like I should have done it this way. So you rerun the statistical analyses, because there's no hard and fast route saying, if you do this sort of experiment, you should do this sort of statistical analysis. So you maybe run it in a different sort of way. You find the same result. There's no effect, and you think, well, I could have sworn that there was going to be a difference between these two groups.
There should be a difference. You can even go so far as to say, given all of the other research, I must be doing something wrong. Yeah.
So let's look at my participants again. Well, that person didn't do the experiment very well, so let's maybe ditch their data. And you make these kind of little tweaks and changes. In and of themselves, none of them are wrong per se, but the net accumulation is that you keep running a statistical analysis, and then eventually you get the result that you wanted. You get a result that shows that the people in the violent game condition were more aggressive than the people in the non-violent
and then
condition.
I stop.
And then you go, aha, that was the right statistical analysis to do. I've got it right now. And like you say, then you stop. And that's not a particularly good way to do science, because the more statistical analyses you run, the higher the chance you'll get of just getting a random significant effect. But also what happens as well, or what tends to happen, again, across psychology, not just in video games research, is that when you come to write that paper up for publication, you don't talk about all of these extra analyses and all of these weird things that you did with the data. You just talk about what you did at the end to get that final result. So when another scientist comes along and reads that paper, what they think you did is actually quite different to how things panned out in reality. And that's been a bit, so these things are called questionable research practices, this idea of, if you keep adding more participants into a sample until you get the result that you think you want, or you keep doing different sorts of analyses and then only report the one that quote unquote worked, things like that. So these are called questionable research practices, and actually they're quite prolific in psychology generally.
Generally, not just video game psychology studies.
No, you do see them quite often in video games research, but you see them across the board, mostly in social psychology research. But again, because some of these decisions, it's not clear what they should be beforehand. And I should say that, for the most part, people who do this, researchers who do this, I don't think they're doing it deliberately, like they're being fraudulent in any sort of way. Part of it is that it's kind of how we've been brought up as researchers to explore data in this sort of way, without that understanding of what the implications of doing these things are.
So those repercussions or implications are, I guess, one, that you could just not have the correct results or not have the correct interpretation.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
other researchers who come along and try to do additional research to build on what you've done, which is a core part of the scientific method, can't replicate what you've done because they're either didn't know what you did, like they're missing steps and it wasn't clearly
Yeah.
articulated. And so you have what kind of psychology is going through with the replication biases, crisis, where people are not able to repeat results from classic or long-standing studies.
Yeah, and there are all sorts of problems at all different levels in the system as well.
Yeah.
So, for reasons that I'm not quite clear on, psychologists seem to really like positive effects. So, where you show that there is a difference between X and Y,
Mm-hmm.
And they tend to dislike sort of negative or null findings where you don't really find any effects. And the problem there is that, so if you go back to my example where I've messed around with my data and I've got this effect that shows that there's a difference between violent and non-violent gameplay, and I get that published. If somebody else comes along and tries to do a similar sort of study or a replication of my study or a conceptual replication where they're trying to mimic the effect but in a slightly different sort of setting, and they find a null result, so they keep doing these sorts of studies and they find actually there's no differences between the violent and non-violent groups. It's remarkably hard to get those sorts of studies published.
Yeah, even included in meta-analyses or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, so then the problem you've got is something called the file drawer effect, which is that there might be, say, 3 papers that are published in an area that all show that violent video games cause aggression. But actually, there were 100 studies that were conducted on this effect.
Yeah.
97 of them showed nothing, but they were never published. But the scientific record shows that there's a unanimous, unequivocal effect. So there's all sorts of issues all over the place in terms of incentives. Scientists are under a massive pressure to publish. If you want to get a job at a university, there's a pressure to have lots of published papers on your CV. So you might unconsciously try to do whatever you can to get those papers published. Even little things like, say you run a study where you've got 1,000 participants, you could maybe publish one paper that's a really strong paper that has 1,000 people in the sample, or you could slice up that data
Yeah.
in a way that kind of makes sense. But you maybe have like 100 studies with 10 participants each that all show these amazing effects, and then you've got 100 papers from the same data set, but they're all really weak papers.
Yeah, because
you
don't have the statistical power you need to detect differences between groups when you have 20 people in a group.
Sure. So from a scientific perspective, the first route is the best thing to do because that's the way to do good science. But from a kind of career perspective,
Mm-hmm.
I guess, the best thing to do is to slice everything up because that's what will give you more of a chance of getting the job you want. So those things are always kind of at odds with each other. And that's all really horrible and it sounds really negative and rubbish. But the point of that chapter was to say, well, look, these things are happening. We know that they're happening, but psychology is trying to change its act. And a lot of these sorts of issues aren't actually just unique to psychology even. So you can see them in other scientific disciplines.
Mm-hmm.
But what I've noted over the past few years is that it's psychologists that are leading the way in terms of trying to enact reforms and fix these sorts of things. So this is where things like pre-registration come in. Yeah,
pre-registration seems to be a pretty good response to this problem. So what is it and how does it work?
So the basic idea here is that all of those decisions that you need to make about how a study is going to go and how you analyze it, you declare those up front. So you write a document to say, here's the background literature on why I want to do this study and why it's worth doing. Here are my methods. This is what I'm going to do to collect my data. And once I've collected my data from a number of participants that I've pre-specified, this is how I'm going to analyze my data. So you do that, and then you publish it online. So there's something called the Open Science Framework, which you can upload these pre-registration forms to. You put that up there, and then once you've done that, that's the point at which you start collecting your data. And you stick really rigidly to the pre-registration document that you've set up.
Or you fess up if you had a good reason for changing something.
Yeah. So the idea would be that at the end, when you have a paper that you're trying to get published, you have followed everything that you said you were going to do in your methods, and you've done the analyses that you said you were going to do. If along the way you go, well, actually, it would have been good to do this analysis as well. That's fine, but it's declared as such in the paper. So you might have a sort of secondary results section that's called post hoc analyses or exploratory analyses, where you say, look, this is what I said I was going to do, and I did it. In the course of doing the study, this came up as a good idea, so we're going to do that as well. And that's absolutely fine. It just keeps science honest, basically. Yeah. So it stops people from inadvertently saying, this amazing analysis that I just came up with at the last minute was actually the thing that I planned to do all along.
Right. And I eliminated these 7 people from the sample just for reasons, or I'm not even going to tell you that I eliminated them.
Yeah, I mean, it's good for other reasons as well, I think. So there are kind of various levels of rigidity in terms of how you pre-register a study. So the most rigid form of it, or the most robust form of it that we've got at the minute, is something called a registered report. So what happens there is that for scientific journals that offer this sort of format, you submit your pre-registration plan to the journal and it undergoes peer review. That's nice as well, because it means that reviewers can offer feedback and ideas for an experiment before it's actually been run, so they can actually make a difference in terms of improving it before the data have been collected. So that goes through a peer review process, and if it's accepted, then whatever happens in your study, whatever result you get, whether it's a positive finding, a negative finding, null finding, whatever, it will get published regardless.
Yeah, that's
so
cool.
The incentive shifts. Yeah, the incentive shifts from trying to get a positive finding in order to get published to trying to come up with a good methodology in order to get published.
Yeah. So all of that about questionable research practices and pre-registration and such said, what's your take on, say, the violence in video game debate, and what did you write about it in the book, and especially around terms of, do violent video games make people violent outside of games?
Yeah, so all of those problems around questionable research practices apply really directly to that specific question. And as a really good case in point, there was a paper that came out a few years ago that looked at the most often used measure of aggression in these sorts of video game studies. So again, go back to what I said earlier, it's really hard to do these sorts of experiments. Mm-hmm. If you read the introduction to these papers, invariably they talk about situations where there maybe has been a recent mass shooting, and once the media has gone into the background of the shooter, it's been found out that they play video games, and therefore it's because they play video games that caused them to do this horrendous act. And if that's the question that we want to answer, is there a situation where if certain types of people play certain types of games, they're going to cause other people harm or cause themselves harm? That's a really important question to answer. It's really important for society that we kind of get that right. But how you effectively mimic that in the lab is not a trivial question. Yeah. You can't set up an experiment where you give people a violent game to play and then you stick them in a room with 10 other people and a gun, and your aggression measure is how many people are left alive.
Yeah. Review boards tend to frown upon actually exposing people, especially children, to violence.
Even situations where you've got something innocuous as your aggression measure, but you're exposing children to games that they shouldn't really be playing is ethically really dubious. So what you end up having is these proxy measures of aggression, things that look like aggression, but they're not actually hurting anybody. And the most commonly used form of this in video games research is something called the Taylor Competitive Reaction Time Task, where very basically you get people to play a game, a violent game or a non-violent game, and then you say, okay, we're going to play another game now. It's a reaction time game. You're going to play it in a room on your own to computer, and there's going to be somebody else somewhere in the university who's also playing it against you. Something's going to appear on the screen at some point, and as soon as you see it, you've got to press the space bar. And if you press it first, you win. If they press it first, you lose. So the other person doesn't actually exist. It's all controlled by the computer. But the aggression measure is that if you win, or whoever wins gets to punish their opponent with a loud noise. And you get to choose how loud the noise is and how long it lasts for. So you're being more aggressive if you blast your opponent with a louder noise for a longer period of time. Now, there was a study that came out a few years ago that showed that if you look at the research literature that's used this measure, actually the way in which people analyze the data is not standardized at all. So some people maybe only use the average loudness of the noise. Some people only use the average duration. Some people use the loudness times the duration, and so on and so forth. So there's no consistency. The other thing that's an issue is that if you take a single data set and you analyze it in all of the different ways in which people do analyze this data in the research literature, then you can literally find whatever you want. You can find that violent video games do cause aggression. You can find that there's a null effect. You can find that they definitely don't cause aggression. So it's nothing to do with a signal in the data. It's entirely down to those decisions that you make about what to do with the data that will give you the results that you get, whatever that is. So a lot of that research suffers from those sorts of methodological problems. And as such, I don't really buy any of the effects that we see in that literature. We're starting to see some studies that are being pre-registered now and doing things like making data openly available so people can interrogate that and check it for problems and things like that. When you start looking at that more robust research, then what you tend to find is that if there are any links between playing violent games and aggressive behaviors, they're very, very small, and there's certainly really nothing to worry about.
They're short-lived too.
Yeah.
So, I mean, do you think that the natural or a reasonable response to that kind of research at this point is just say, bah, like just ignore it, or no, that's not true. Everybody's got an agenda. Like what would be a reasonable response to that question?
Kind of sadness in a way, weirdly. I think a lot of psychologists have wasted a lot of time trying to answer this question in really kind of rubbish ways, basically. And there are so many more interesting questions that we can ask about video game effects that have just kind of been lost in the noise, really. That general question of, do violent games cause aggression? To my mind, the answer is, well, not really. We shouldn't really be worrying about it. So we should just put that debate to rest and think about other things that maybe we should be worried about a little more.
Do you think that it's possible to do good research on that question and answer it with good research?
It's a good question. It's a really good question. I don't know. I've struggled with this for a few years, trying to come up with something that's maybe a little bit more of a robust way of measuring aggression that isn't susceptible to these sort of levels of flexibility in the stats. And there is stuff that you can do, but you're still always running up against that problem of you're using proxy measures of aggression. So even with the best will of the world, those sorts of experimental studies can't really go that far in terms of answering the big societal questions around video game violence. There are other sorts of studies that really help with that, though. So longitudinal studies where you follow a bunch of people over a course of a few years. Some of them are going to play games that they shouldn't do because they're too young. Some of them aren't. Some of them are going to end up having conduct disorder problems later on. Some of them aren't. Those sorts of studies are a little bit more realistic, where you can track these trends in people who play video games. And again, the good studies out there show that there are some weak effects, but they're really nothing to worry about. So I think generally it would be great if we could put that debate to rest now and try and move on to better questions.
So maybe one of those questions is, are video games addictive? Is there such thing as problematic game use? So what do you think, and what did you write about the gaming addiction debate?
My thinking is sort of similar to what I think about the whole violent video game question, in a sense, in that you see a lot of the similar sorts of problems in the way that gaming addiction research has been done as you do in the violent game debate. So, but the addiction one's a little bit weirder in a sense, because it's much more at the forefront of people's minds at the minute, because the World Health Organization classified gaming disorder as a diagnosable disorder this past year.
And the American Association for the DSM-5 is brushing up against that. They've said that, like, this may be a thing. We should actually do research and verify that it's a thing. But the message most people get from that is, this is a thing.
You've basically summarized my addiction chapter in about 5 words, which is great. It's great. I wish I could have done that myself. So the DSM included, I think, called it internet gaming disorder as a disorder for future research, or that requires further research, back in 2013. And I think that was actually a really good thing to do. The idea behind it was that you say, okay, look, we're worried about this thing. We don't know whether it actually exists or not. So we need more research to try and figure out what the hell it is. And we're including some criteria here. You can use those, change them, develop them, adapt them, but let's try and figure out what's going on. And that's a good thing. It was there to try and prompt good exploratory research in the area to try and figure out whether this was an actual thing or not. The problem is, as you very succinctly put, that a lot of researchers just took that to mean, okay, this is a thing. These are the criteria that describe that thing. Let's go and create some questionnaires using those criteria. And when you do that, you will always get a spectrum of people on a questionnaire, some of whom don't meet the criteria and some of whom do.
So in a way, this links back to the point you were making earlier about gaming motivations, that if you approach it with a confirmatory way, with a tool that's intended to measure how much these things exist, that's what you're going to end up with.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you've not thought beforehand about what is the thing that we're trying to look at here and how is it unique from and differs from, say, gambling addiction or substance use disorder, is there anything that's unique that we need to really nail down? If you don't do that, then you end up missing what gaming addiction or gaming disorder is. So you end up kind of actually just measuring some sort of problematic gambling, but calling it gaming addiction instead. So a good example of this is one of the criteria for gaming addiction in its various guises is that you play for long periods of time and it causes problems in your life. But a lot of people have just sort of narrowed that down to you play video games for a long period of time. And that's the thing that people worry about when you see kind of worries from parents about the fact that their kids are just playing, I don't know, Fortnite for like 4 hours at a time.
Yeah, it's usually Fortnite.
Yeah, that's the worry. So what the science hasn't done a good job of yet is distinguishing between people who are high-intensity players. So they play video games for a lot of the time, but that doesn't cause them any problems in terms of relationships or job or anything like that. So high-intensity, unproblematic players from people who have problematic levels of gameplay. It's very hard to distinguish between those groups of people, and really that's what you want to do. You don't want on a questionnaire a question that's something along the lines of how many hours of video games do you play per day? And if there's a cutoff at, like, say it's 4 hours, anybody who says more than 4 hours, then they get 1 point in the box of they're addicted to video games. That's a really bad thing to do, because some people will play video games a lot of the time and it will be absolutely fine. Some people do it for their jobs, games journalists, esports players, they will be high intensity gamers, but it won't necessarily be a problem. So
yeah, and you would expect that any reasonable clinician would take that into account when making a diagnosis. Like, okay, this person's a Twitch streamer. I'm not going to diagnose them as necessarily being an addict.
You'd hope so. And one of the other criteria in the WHO listing is that this has to go on for a long period of time. I think it's more than 6 months. But the thing that worried me about that a little bit was that there was a caveat to it, which was that, but in severe circumstances, you can ignore that criteria, basically. So it adds that kind of level of flexibility that, if you've got somebody who's really, 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 really worried about their kid because they bought a new game for them on Saturday and they've just played it for 12 hours non-stop, that at what point do you make a clear clinical decision about when that's going to be problematic for that person or not? And if you apply a precautionary approach, you might then start diagnosing people with a disorder that they don't actually have. And that's a problem that we see in the wider research literature about the prevalence rates of gaming addiction. If you look at that literature, the prevalence rates are everything from
very low.
So it's as low as 0.2% of the gaming population, but some studies claim that it's as high as 49%. So one of those
can't be right.
Well, one of those numbers has got to be massively out, right? I think the best estimates, people say it's around about 2 to 3%, but even those estimates come with caveats. But if you apply the criteria that shows that 49% of people are addicted to video games, when actually in reality 3% are, then you're overdiagnosing. You're saying that there's this massive swathe of people who actually don't have a problem have a disorder, and that's a real issue. I think we have to be really careful that we don't fall down that route. And equally the other way around as well. If you say that what you don't want to do is miss the people who actually are having problems, that nobody is saying in this debate that there aren't some people out there for whom video gaming can become problematic and they can become addicted to it. Nobody's saying that at all. The question is, how do we best identify those people so that we can treat them appropriately? And we don't really have any good answers to that yet.
So how much of this discussion do you think applies to things like, loot boxes, which are sort of the hot topic of the day, like of the last year or so, and those sort of icky ways that some companies are trying to get in-app purchases or in-game purchases out of people?
So these are the right sorts of questions to ask, right? I think if you look at video games as a general construct, it's pointless asking, are video games addictive or not? The answer to that is no, in the same way as asking, does eating food make you fat, right? It depends what type of food, it depends what you're doing. Are you doing any exercise? Why are you eating nothing but burgers all day? All of that sort of stuff. You can break down that question into nonsense very quickly. But the right sorts of questions are to look at the more specific aspects of video game mechanisms and say, well, look, are there some problematic mechanisms that are used? And if we remove them from games, how does it change the experience of them? So loot boxes are a really good example of this. So loot boxes, I think, are really problematic in that they basically look like gambling, right? So, you're paying money to buy some credits that you then use to purchase a chance at winning something that is either undesirable because you've got a million copies of it already, or really, really rare but really desirable. So you'll keep being compelled to kind of keep trying until you get that thing. The argument, certainly in the UK, is that the only reason that this basically isn't gambling is because the things that you get in loot boxes don't have any external monetary value, really, which I think is quite a dated
get them out of the system.
Yeah, well, you can with some games, but for the most part, I think this is quite a dated way of thinking about them, because for all intents and purposes, the same sorts of psychological weaknesses that casinos use to exploit problematic gambling, those are the sorts of things that you see used in loot boxes as well. So so the thing about loot boxes is that going back to that second part of the question is, if you remove these mechanisms from games, how does it change the experience of them? And I would say that if you got rid of loot boxes completely tomorrow, no game would be adversely affected, apart from the rubbish ones on mobiles that are only there to make money, right? So, and Star Wars Battlefront 2 is a really good example of this, right? So they implemented loot boxes. There was a massive uproar about the fact that people had to pay for them. So they removed that element from them. There were still loot boxes in the game, but it was all free and it was all just acquired through experience leveling. Didn't change the game in terms of any sort of quality whatsoever. And in fact, if you removed loot boxes altogether, you'd still have a really good game. So there's no need for these sorts of mechanisms in games. They only exist, really, in my mind, to act as a monetization mechanism. And that's fine. I get that developers need to make money, but that shouldn't come at the cost of causing mental health issues or behavioral issues with their player base.
Yeah. And that to me seems to be where the research is lacking, of like, well, okay, you can draw a pretty clear case that these mechanics are pretty similar to the mechanics that gambling houses use, that casinos use, and so forth. But then it seems like the next question to ask is like, well, to what detriment or not, right? Does it cause mental health issues? Does it put people like children or problematic gamblers at risk, and so forth?
Yeah.
And I know there's some research going on in that right now, but it's in early days.
It's very early days, yeah. But the little research that we have at the minute seems to suggest that there is a correlation between problematic gambling behaviors. So that's not full-blown addiction, but just sort of people on the kind of spectrum of problematic gambling.
Yeah,
so the correlation, so the correlation between that and loot box purchase behavior. So if you play games where you have to spend money to get loot boxes, there's a correlation there, and the strength of the correlation varies depending on various different aspects of the loot boxes themselves. So if the loot boxes have some sort of monetary value, so in Counter-Strike, for instance, you can sell stuff that you get in loot boxes on open marketplaces, there's a stronger correlation. If it's just stuff that you can use in-game that doesn't have any impact on the game itself, so it's just things like cosmetic skins, there's a weaker correlation, but it's still there. Now, correlation does not equal causation, as we all know, so we don't know whether it's the case that loot box purchase behavior is causing increases in problematic gambling, or whether it's people who show problems with gambling are more drawn to games that have loot boxes in them. But in a sense, it doesn't matter which way it is. So if it's the case that people who have levels of problematic gambling are drawn to these sorts of games, then you can argue that what these games are doing is exploiting vulnerable populations. If it's the opposite, if it's that if you start playing games that have loot boxes in them and that creates problems in gambling, then these sorts of games, well, they're causing problems for people. So either way, it's not a particularly good story. Like you say, though, this is really, really early days on this sort of research. And as far as I know, we don't really know too much about how this sort of stuff works in terms of in-app purchase behavior in mobile games, for example, what the links are there. So we need to do a lot more really to get a handle on it. But the problem, I think, for video games developers is that these things are already starting to be regulated and legislated against. So the Belgium Gambling Commission said that loot boxes are a form of gambling last year. There's legislation in the US that's trying to be put through to do something similar. I think in the UK we'll see something very similar probably within the next 6 to 12 months as well. So I think developers who use these sorts of systems maybe cynically as a way of getting a lot of money really quickly need to sort of take a little bit of an introspective look and think about what these things are and what sort of effects they're having on their players and what it is that they want to do with their games as well, like what the point of them is in the end. Are they there to be entertaining experiences for people, or are they there just to make money?
Yeah, and a lot of that research that you're describing was done by David Zendel,
Yes.
who I had as a guest on the podcast a few episodes ago, episode 47, where he talked about his research around loot boxes and gambling. So if anybody wants a deeper dive on that, they can go listen to that episode if they haven't already. I think it's probably about time to start wrapping it up. Let me ask a couple of questions that I ask everybody that comes on the show. The first one is, what have you been playing lately? Have you had any time with I know you've got a newborn and a job and you're doing this book thing, but have you squeezed in any gaming time?
So yeah, I've got a 6-week-old baby girl at the minute who is eating.
What's she playing?
All
Is anything
my
good?
sleep. She's playing the Let's Not Sleep game.
You lose.
I always lose. Do you know what though? In the first sort of couple of weeks when she wasn't really sleeping through the night and we were doing night shifts, my wife and I found that my Nintendo Switch was an absolute godsend.
Yeah.
So when she would only sleep in our arms. So once she actually did nod off, I had just enough motor control to be able to pick up my Switch and start playing games. So I ended up playing Doom for a bit. Cool. Which was, just kind of mindless. I didn't really have to think about it too much. I've been playing a game called Block Quest Maker as well, which is kind of like a 3D isometric game where you can create your own levels, and they're all sort of like little puzzle games. So there's a few kind of developer-made levels, but really the richness in that game is the kind of fan community of people who've made their own levels, and people have made like entire RPGs within a single level. And they're really, really hard as well, but they're great. And people like recreated Super Mario Brothers and stuff like that. Yeah. So I've been playing that quite a lot.
What was that called again?
That's called Block Quest Maker, or BQM.
Okay.
I think you can download it for the iPhone and Android as well. And when I can, which is not very often at the minute, I've been trying to play World of Warcraft. So I've been playing that since about 2009. And I just love that game. I've got a bunch of friends on there in a small but perfectly formed guild. It's always nice to catch up with them, and there's always new content for it as well. So there's always something new and interesting to do in that world. It's a little bit more of an in-depth game though, so I only tend to play that when I've got a decent chunk of time.
Yeah, there's no quick.
Actually do it.
Yeah, a quick session of World of Warcraft is a totally different animal than a full session.
Yeah. So those have been most of the games that I've been playing recently. I downloaded Lemmings for my phone the other day.
Oh, okay.
Just to go for a nostalgia trip.
That's a deep cut. Yeah.
I know. Yeah, it's nothing like the original, and it's really annoying because every 30 seconds or so you've got to watch an advert to get some more lives, and it's one of those irritating freemium games that I absolutely loathe.
Yeah, hard pass.
Which is a real shame because I love the original.
Yeah, I kind of haven't been playing a whole lot of games lately, wrapping up some other projects, but I tried Outer Wilds on the Xbox, which is,
Okay, yeah.
have you heard about this? It's like it's hard to explain. It's an exploration kind of game. You play this little alien astronaut who's going around his solar system and exploring, but kind of the world ends like every, I don't know, it was like 40 minutes or so and resets. And when you die, everything resets. So you're trying to like solve the mystery of what's going on. And
Oh, that sounds kind of cool.
yeah,
And
it's the kind of game
quite
where like, if you know what to do, you can finish it in minutes.
right,
But
yeah.
the point of the game is figuring out what to do through all of these loops of games.
It's like a sci-fi version of Groundhog Day.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah. So that one's pretty interesting. So let me also ask, tell me about one good habit that you have. Like what's one good habit that you've created and cultivated, or maybe you're just getting underway?
That's a really good question. So generally, one thing that I'm trying really hard to do at the minute is learn how to say no.
Okay.
So I'm very bad at it, and I get very excited about things that people suggest, and I always want to help people out. So whenever somebody comes up to me with a project idea, I'm like, yeah, I'll definitely do that.
Yeah.
And having a new baby has completely refocused what my priorities are, and she is 100% my priority now.
Sure.
So things that maybe 6 months ago would have been awesome things to do, I'm finding actually it quite liberating to be able to say, no, I can't do that anymore.
Just point at the baby then. Yeah.
Yeah, because you get into this situation where you say yes to so many things, you have too much on your plate, and it just all becomes a massive stress, and none of it becomes fun anymore. So focusing on things that I personally find interesting and have time for, and then ditching everything else, is something that I've been trying to work on over the past few weeks.
Cool. Well, I appreciate your not saying no to appearing on this podcast.
It's something that I wanted to do, and it was
there you go. Awesome. So where should people go on the internet to find out more about you and to find out about the book, which again is called Lost in a Good Game, Why We Play Video Games and What They Can Do for Us?
So the easiest thing to do is just Google either me or the name of my book. It's the only book that's called that, so hopefully it should be one of the top things. I have a website, which is peteetchells.com, that's got some details on there. Probably the easiest way to find out stuff about me is to come and find me on Twitter. So my Twitter handle's @peteetchells. I'm on there all the time, sharing stuff about video games and pictures of cats usually, and increasingly
Sure.
pictures of my daughter. So
yeah,
and I'm always happy to chat about video game stuff on there.
Cool. And that's Etchells is Etchells.
That's the one. Yeah.
Yep. Awesome. Well, thanks again so much for coming on and talking about this. I would personally recommend checking out the book and the other stuff that you've done. And it's good to always kind of hear more about the process that went into it and what you were working on and what you're thinking.
Yeah, great. Thanks for having me, Jamie.
Hey, thanks for sticking around to the end of this episode of the Psychology of Games podcast. I hope you enjoyed that. You can go and find out more about Pete's book at any of the places that we just mentioned, and I recommend that you do so. So come back next episode, and you'll get to hear another conversation with another author of a book that I read this summer about psychology and games and so forth. And if you want to go to psychologygames.com and subscribe to the podcast, you can find out how to do that there. Or you can just kind of search for Psychology of Games in your favorite podcast app or wherever it is that you get and listen to podcasts. And you can subscribe. And then I will sneak into your home in the middle of the night and deliver the podcast directly to your device. Thanks, and I'll talk to you next episode.